Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning and welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. The Signpost webinar is brought to you by Teagasc in conjunction with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland Skillnet and National Rural Network. This morning, I'm joined by Padraig Foley, who will be taking questions and asking questions. Good morning, Padraig.
Morning, Pat. Thanks for having me.
And speaking this morning, I'm joined by Seamus Kearney. Seamus is Signpost Programme Specialist with Teagasc, and Jonathan Herron. Jonathan is a postdoc researcher at Moorepark. You might just give us an idea of what you do down at Moorepark?
Yeah, so the area which I'm working in is called life cycle assessment. So it's just methodology that's there to calculate environmental impacts, basically from ruminant systems. So predominantly dairy based. So I'm currently on Vista Mill project. So just working on calculating the environmental impact of dairy systems and how we can reduce them. And doing that with the Signpost Programme.
You'll be looking at a couple of case studies of Signpost assessments. Seamus, I think you're up first this morning. Seamus, you're a specialist with the Signpost Programme. Do you want to introduce the Signpost Programme to us a little bit?
Yeah, I suppose, look, I'm coming from a background of 25 years working as a dairy advisor with dairy clients in Cavan and Waterford. So I've taken up the role of training and development specialist with the Signpost Programme since May this year. So what the background to the Signpost Programme is, there's over 100 farmers spread throughout the country. All the different enterprises have been incorporated into the Signpost Programme, where latest technology will be implemented on those farms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The inputs and the profitability will be measured in these farms to see what kind of emission reduction that we can achieve on these farms, and to use these then as exemplar farms to spread the message to the wider community. So they're kind of lighthouse farms to help all farmers reduce their emissions. And look, I suppose the title of my presentation is looking at, I suppose, the practical actions that Irish farmers can take on to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on Irish farms. So it's all about taking action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I suppose what I'm going to look at this morning is just to break down the challenge facing agriculture. I want to briefly look at the emissions by the type of enterprise at farm level. We're going to put in place the building blocks that each farmer can implement to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions on their farm. We're going to quantify the actions and briefly look at what kind of effect these could have on a suckler and a store to whaling operation. And I suppose the one thing with farmers we're very conscious of, there's a lot of anxiety and worry out there. What does this mean for farmers at ground level? And I suppose put into context, I suppose the big figure that has been given to agriculture as of last week was we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by between 22 and 30% by 2030. And that's from a basis of the emissions we had as a sector in 2018. And it can be very cause anxiety for farmers. But look, this morning we're going to break it down into small little bite-sized chunks. And I suppose just a picture of an elephant there, like how do you eat an elephant? You do it one bite at a time. And it's the very same with breaking down what this means to farmers at ground level. So to put into context, this screen here is just showing, the red bar is just showing on average for the last 2 years, for 19 and 20, that agriculture reduced its emissions by 1.3% per annum. Now, to put into context, when we break down the emissions that we have to meet in agriculture for the next 5 years, at the end of the year, the agricultural sector has to reduce its overall emissions by 2.5% a year, between 2 and 3%, 2.5% per year on average, and 4.5% per year for the following 5 years after that. Now, we're not going to worry about beyond 25. We'll go as far as half time. We'll go into the dressing room, we'll get some water in, and we'll take on the second half then after. So for the first half, we have to achieve a reduction on our greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture by 2.5% per year for the next 5 years. And how is this measured? It's measured by the CSO. So what I just put up here is a little snapshot. And basically this figure here on the screen for 2019 is showing that agriculture emissions within Ireland reduced by 4% in 2019. And what was behind that 4% reduction? The big one was that fertilizer use on Irish farms reduced by 10%. Now, as part of that, there was also the starting to switch to protected urea, which had a knock-on effect in a positive way, and also the switch to low emission slurry spreading from 2018. And these are based from 18 to 19, and 18 is the basis for emissions for agriculture going forward. Now, lime did reduce that year by 25%. That would have a knock-on effect of reducing this by about 0.5% overall, and the dairy cow numbers went up by about 2.8%. Now, the suckler cow numbers went down something similar. If we then look at 2020, the agricultural emissions went up 1.4%. What was the driver behind that? 3.5% more fertilizer used on farms. Dairy cow numbers went up about 3.2%, but the suckler cow numbers did reduce somewhat similar. Okay, so fertilizer use has big bearing on what happens on emissions on Irish farms. So before we look at the actions, maybe just to break down the kind of profile of the emissions at different farms in Ireland. So first of all, we're going to look at a dairy footprint. And what I put up here is what a farmer gets back on his Board BIA audit, his feedback report. And if we look at it here, the light blue bars is showing the emissions for the average farm from 75 to 100 cows within Ireland. The other bars here was the individual farmer's previous audit and his current audit. So we're going to focus on the blue bars, the average farmer. And on average, the average dairy farmer in Ireland has 90 milking cows. So the average dairy farmer falls into this category here. 43% of their total emissions come from animal digestion. There is 22% of their emissions coming from the cows manuring at grass, manuring in the sheds, how they store the manure, and also how they spread the manure. So 65% of the emissions come from pretty much related to animal or manure management. We're looking at 16% from fertilizer, 11% from feed, 7% from energy use. So 35% from inputs, 65% from the cow. So even by cutting these by half, we're still only getting to about 17-18% of a reduction overall on dairy farms. So if we look at suckler farms, the average suckler farm, again, we look at a suckler to weaning store farm. Again, the blue bar is the average for the enterprise. So 58% of emissions on suckler to weaning store farms are coming from animal digestion at farm level. 31% is coming from the cow producing manure at grass, how the manure is stored and spread, 4% from fertilizer use, 1% from meal, and 6% from energy use. So almost 90% related to the animal, 11% on inputs. So inputs alone aren't going to get the reduction on dry stock farms. We have to look at the amount of cows per calf per year, when the heifers are calving, reducing animals in an earlier age. That's what comes into account on the dry stock farms. So maybe we'll look next at, I suppose, the practical actions that farmers can undertake to reduce their emissions at farm level. So like any good house, you have to put in a solid foundation. So the foundation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions at farm level, first of all, is soil fertility. It's about getting the lime, the P, and the K right. Okay, if the lime soil fertility is correct, and only 18% of Irish soils are optimum for lime, P, and K, that will reduce naturally occurring nitrogen from the ground. The second thing is we need to look at productive animals. So cows, dairy cows with good EBI. So getting more production from less cows. And in relation to suckler stock, it's breeding cows that will have a calf per cow per year, good weight gain, earlier finish, which follows on to the beef farmer then as well. It's having healthy animals that they're performing while they're on the farm. And to be cognizant of all times, we need to improve water quality and maintain it. So we need to adhere to buffer zones, so no slurry within 5 meters of any open drain. And we need to have fences back 1.5 meters. And we need to be careful with our timing of applications of slurry and fertilizer. And we also have to improve on biodiversity. From Catherine Keenan's talk last week is about hedgerow management, incorporating and maintaining trees, and maintaining high value nature on these farms. When the foundation is right, we then start putting in the other next layer of blocks on top of it. And the next layer of blocks is all about the type of fertilizer we use. And we'll come on to that now in a minute, when we put it out and how much we use. It's about having enough slurry storage, that we put out the slurry at the right time and we spread it by the right methods. It's about keeping stock as long as possible at grass measuring and giving good quality grass during the summer, during the grazing season. And when all these parts are together, then we look at clover and mixed species swards to establish them in existing and in new reseeds to try and reduce the amount of nitrogen used at farm level. But be cognizant of all time that when we talk about sustainability, it's social, economic, and environmental sustainability. So the farmer is the person at the center of the whole thing, and farm profitability has to be increasing as we go. So we just look at some of the actions, and looking at animal productivity, the economic breeding index for dairy cows. How does it work? Basically, for every €10 increase in EBI, it translates to more money in the farmer's pocket, €20 more profit per cow per year. But at the same time, by having more efficient cows, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emission, the footprint, by 1% for every increase in EBI of €10. And how does that work? It comes through by having more mature herds, higher milk solids per cow, and it also helps by lowering the replacement rates. Does bring the replacement rates back from 25 towards 18 to 20%. So it's about getting the same output or a little bit more output with less animals. And it's very much the same principle with the maternal replacement index, where it's about improving health and survival. It's getting a calf per cow per year, earlier finished animals, shorter calving intervals. So more productive type cows where you're getting the same output with less amount of inputs. The next bit we move on to is looking at grassland management and how does that affect the greenhouse gas emissions. And from work done on research, every extra week of grass can reduce the carbon footprint of product, be that lamb, beef, or milk, by 1%. So every extra week of grass can reduce the carbon footprint by 1%. And likewise with quality grass, this would be probably relevant during the summer months. Grazing the appropriate good grazing covers of 1,400 covers for the summer versus very strong grass of 2,000 covers. That can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 15% per day. Now, we're talking about a period of maybe 6 to 8 weeks throughout the year where this could actually happen, where the grass starts getting very strong, where grassland management mightn't be top class. So it could give an overall reduction in footprint over a full year of 1 to 2%. Now, and I suppose the knock on that is if by improving the grassland management and the quality of grass the cows are eating, it will lead on to reducing the amount of meal that needs to be fed per cow. And from work that Jonathan and Lawrence Shalhoub have done in Moorepark, reducing meal feeding by between 50 and 100 kilos of meal per cow can reduce the overall footprint by 1% overall. And the other thing we look at is silage quality. Higher DMD silage has lower fibre. So lower DMD silage has higher fibre, and higher fibre creates more methane. So by having better quality silage, we can also lower our greenhouse gas emissions. So the next area we move on to is fertilizer, and the type of fertilizer has a huge bearing on what it does for our overall emissions as an industry. So protected urea, I suppose the protected urea tis only 1/4 of the emissions of CAN. So it's 4 times more environmentally friendly than CAN-based fertilizers. So it's lower in ammonia, and it's also lower in nitrous oxide. And from some case studies that Jonathan has put through, and you'll see in Jonathan's figures in a minute, the protected urea in a dairy farm, going from 100% CAN to 100% protected urea, it can reduce the overall emissions on a dairy farm by 78%. If we do the same principle on a beef farm, we're looking at a 2 to 4% reduction overall. The reason being the fertilizer use on beef farms is substantially lower than dairy farms. And these farms here with 7 to 8% reduction is spreading 200, 250 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. So I suppose you could say that protected urea, I suppose, is the agriculture's answer to the electric car. It's a different version of the same product to get you the same end result, but has way lower emissions from a farming point of view. By reducing the fertilizer as a next port of call, by reducing fertilizer on dairy farms, we can get a reduction of up to 5% in greenhouse gas emissions. On beef farms, the same principle, again, due to less fertilizer being used, the reduction can be 1 to 2%. Okay, so protected urea, so the type of fertilizer has a massive bearing, first of all. Then it's about trying to reduce the amount of fertilizer overall. And we're very cognizant on that. With the price of fertilizer, what it looks like for next year, farmers will probably have to be more specific with when they put out fertilizer, what they put out, and the timing of when they put it out. So we come back to soil fertility, and look, I suppose the one thing is, while availability of fertilizer could be a big issue next year, the starting point is lime. By getting the lime P and K right, we can release up to 80 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year from naturally occurring mineralization in the soil. That's up to 60 units per acre. And to put into context, our national herd for 18, 19, 20, 21 is pretty much similar in size-wise. And if I go back to 1974, the national herd today, 7.3 million head of animals. It was 7.2 in 1974. But the big difference in 1974 is we were spreading twice the amount of lime in 1974 that we are today. And we were spreading it at a rate of 1 load of lime per year for every 60 livestock units. So that's 2 loads of lime for an average dairy farmer and 1 load of lime for an average dry stock farmer every year to help cut down our fertilizer. We then move on to clover. Clover and mixed species swards can put in up to 100 kilos of nitrogen per year to replace synthetic or chemical fertilizer. When we move on to slurry, the timing of slurry, spreading slurry with a splash plate in the summer will give you about 3 units per 1,000 gallons of nitrogen. If we move that to the springtime, we go from 3 to 6 units per 1,000 gallons. And if we then move again to low emission slurry spreading or environmentally friendly slurry spreading, we can add another 3 units again. So a splash plate in the summer will give you 3 units per 1,000 gallons. A low emission slurry spreader in the springtime before the 1st of May can give you up to 9 units per 1,000 gallons, which will help reduce our fertilizer and our footprint. So briefly looking at it, in what kind of effect could this have on a dairy farm? So if we just take a dairy farm up to 2030, the dairy farms from the Board BF footprints are stocked at just under 2 cows per hectare. So if we can increase an extra week of grass, we can get a 1% reduction in our footprint. Better quality grass in the summer could give another 1%. Cutting the meal, 1%. Now there is a crossover effect on some of these ones here. By increasing the EBI by €10 per year for the next 9 years, that has a knock-on effect possibly of up to 9% reduction on the greenhouse gas emissions. By cutting the nitrogen by 25% can give us another 5% reduction. Protected urea is one of the big wins very quickly, 7%. Low emission slurry spreading, 2%. And by reducing the energy usage on the farm, we're talking about like the solar in that case, could give us another 1% as well. So there is some crossover effect on these, and in some cases it might be milking a few less cows of better production potential. There's a possibility of 23 to 27% there on some dairy farms. And coming back here to the sustainability leaf developed by some of our colleagues in Teagasc, I suppose the principle is it's about improving the breeding of the animals, extending the grazing season, trying to reduce fertilizer through substituting clover, mixed species towards lime, changing protected urea, low emission slurry spreading, reducing energy use. And after that, then we look at trying to sequester more with the likes of maybe incorporating some trees or improving hedgerow management on farms. And then it's about trying to improve our water quality through the ASAP service. If we do the same exercise for a suckler to weaning farm, we're looking at the average stocking rate from the Board BF carbon footprints is about 1.4 lysogunus per hectare. So if we could get an extra 2 weeks of grass, it could reduce the overall emissions by 2%. Better quality grass for the summer, another 1%. One of the big ones for the calving systems is by reducing the calving interval. And the average farm in this scenario here is about 46 livestock units with about 25 cows. By reducing the calving interval from 391 days back to 375 days can give a reduction of 2 to 3% in emissions. But one of the other big ones is moving the heifers calving from 2.5 years back to 2 years can give another 4 or 5% reduction on emissions. Because at the minute, only 23% of all heifers calving on dry stock farms are calving within the 2 year of age mark. Reducing fertilizer by 25% will give a 1% reduction. Protected urea 1 to 2% because of less fertilizer. Low emission slurry spreading another 1 to 2%, and reducing energy a 1%. So possible reduction there of 13 to 16%. But again, the ones to go after have the biggest effect on our national inventory the quickest is less fertilizer, protected urea, and low emission slurry spreading. So to summarize what I've gone through there is, I suppose the good thing is, in order to lower greenhouse gas emissions, it is compatible with good farming and profit for farmers. And the core principle is all about getting the basics right. So it's about starting with our soil fertility, lime, P and K. It's about breeding good, healthy animals. So it's about better rather than more. It's about improving our grassland management and trying to reduce our fertilizer use. And I suppose to look at where can we go after the quick wins to help the overall emissions figure for agriculture for the next 5 years. And that's the first half of the match. And that's about looking at protected urea. That's the simplest switch, is change the fertilizer type. Then it's about how you spread your slurry, spreading it in the spring, and with a low emission slurry spreading, it's efficient use of fertilizer and grassland management. And I would also say that while we don't have to cut our national numbers from a national point of view, on every farm there's marginal cows. On dairy farms, there's probably 5% of the lower cows in the farm wouldn't really be missed from a production point of view, who would take a lot of pressure off the system. And when we talk about suckler farms, there's 17 out of 100 cows on every suckler farm, on average throughout the country, they don't have a calf every year. So it's tidying up the loose ends on somebody's farm. So maybe to finish up with a little shopping list for what you can do for 2022, whether you're a farmer or an advisor working in this industry, I suppose the big areas we have to go after is lime. And as I said earlier on there, lime is like geothermal for agriculture. It can release naturally occurring nitrogen out of the ground. It's about using low emission slurry spreading and getting the slurry out in February, March time to get more use of our slurry next spring. It's about changing the protected urea. And by doing these, we can get a bit of reduction on the fertilizer. I think the price is going to drive some of that as well next year. And it's also about looking at the marginal cow or the surplus stock on farms, where they could be putting pressure on stocking rate. By taking them out of the equation, it could help profitability, help produce your fertilizer, and get longer grazing season at Graston as well. So that's where I finish up, Pat. So I'll hand back to you. And I think Jonathan is going to go through specific case studies then after that.
Okay, thanks very much. That's really clear messaging in that, Seamus. You might stop sharing there if that's okay.
Yeah.
And Jonathan, if you're ready to share.
Yeah.
Well, just while Jonathan's getting ready there, a question coming in, and I suppose it alludes to, I suppose, one of the key questions around dairy herd size. The farmers you're dealing with, and I know most of them will have expanded over the last number of years, but where in general, is it easy, or is it possible to say where their heads are around animal numbers moving forward? Are they leveling out, or are they, some of them, still intending to increase herd size?
Yeah, very good question, Pat. In general, I know from my own experience, I was dealing with 150 farmers in the south of the country, and the big expansion was finished, Pat. It's about tidying up the herds, breeding better stock. It's about better rather than bigger is I think the big message going forward.
Okay. Jonathan, we're seeing your slideshow presentation. If you want to go into display settings, you might.
You're not seeing it as an actual presentation, no?
Not yet. Just try it again there. And if you up at the top of your screen, you'll see display settings. I think there's an option under there to. Yeah. And if you click on that and swap to presenter view, yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay.
Work away.
Yeah, so as I said, my name is Jonathan. I work in Teagasc down in Moorepark in Cork. And today first of all, I'm going to change tact a little bit from what Seamus was talking about, a bit of background into what is, carbon footprint, how our greenhouse gas emissions is calculated, and then give some example farms. So first of all, I'm going to talk about life cycle assessment model, give a bit of context to it, and then the case studies. Yeah. So just to begin then, so life cycle assessment. So life cycle assessment, it's an internationally standardized methodology. And what it does essentially, it calculates the environmental burden of a product, process, or service from the point of raw extraction up to the point in which it's disposed of. And this is different from the national inventory. The way the national inventory works, it's what happens within the country. What life cycle assessment does, it goes a step further. It also accounts what goes into that product to produce it. So there is a difference between life cycle assessment and the inventory. And this could be seen on the graph to your right. So the inventory emissions would only calculate what's in grey, so what happens on farm. But what life cycle assessment does, it accounts for the farm inputs, your fertilizer, your concentrate, additional forage that will be coming into the system, your electricity, your fuel, as well as, you know, if you're bringing livestock into your farm also. So for agriculture systems, what's commonly done, it's a cradle farm gate analysis. And what that means essentially is it's everything up until the point until the milk leaves the farm in the lorry, or you know, the lambs or the cows go in the trailer, or there's wool sold as well, up to the point in which the product leaves the farm essentially. And within that, then we calculate greenhouse gas emissions, ammonia, nitrates, and all that. To make it, I suppose, to communicate the results of the life cycle assessment, you have to express it with a common relatable unit. So for lamb and for beef, it would be per kilo carcass weight or per kilo live weight. For milk, it's per kilo fat and protein corrected milk. And for both of those, then we express per hectare. And that's important because it acts as almost a proxy for total emissions. So, yeah. So just to discuss briefly, I suppose, recent work we've done. So that life cycle assessment I was talking about, that's what we use in Teagasc. It's what's used in Board B to calculate your farm carbon footprints. And previously it was heavily reliant, I suppose, on international default values. And, you know, it was functional, it worked, it was the best available science to us at the moment, at that moment of time. However, the default values, the international default values, they come from numerous studies across the world, not fully representative of our climate or our environment in Ireland. So, you know, the department as well as Teagasc and all that have invested in, you know, in research, try to develop our own methodology to calculate emissions. And that research has come on stream through the form of scientific publications. As well as that, then this has been happening across the globe. So as more science comes on stream, the methodology, you know, the recommended methodology changes, and what you're essentially doing is you're continuously increasing or improving the accuracy of the life cycle assessment model. So just examples of this, I suppose. So previously, all fertilizer types were treated the same in terms of emissions. However, we knew that there was difference in emissions from CAN, urea, and protected urea. We just didn't have the evidence to prove it to, I suppose, the likes of the EPA. Research has been conducted in Teagasc and has been accepted that, you know, there's different emissions for CAN, urea, and protected urea. And this has been accepted by EPA, and it's now in our national inventory and in our life cycle assessment models. Similar then for urine and dung. The nitrogen that's excreted in urine and dung was deemed the same in terms of emissions. However, urine is far more susceptible to nitrogen loss than that of dung. Once again, we needed evidence to show that, to prove it. That has been conducted and has been accepted in the EPA national inventory. So they're also in the national inventory and our life cycle assessment models. On top of that, then too, you know, outside of the farm, I suppose the farm gate, you know, the stuff that's coming onto your farm, let's say, for example, your fertilizer. So the factories that are producing fertilizer, through the years, they've become more efficient. You know, in producing fertilizer, they've also become more conscious about the emissions they're generating, and they have adopted strategies to try to reduce emissions. And that feeds into life cycle assessment because you use fertilizer to grow grass. So that's another benefit. So what this means essentially, so recent work that we've done between ourselves, ICBF and Borbia, we've updated Borbia's life cycle assessment model to calculate the carbon footprint of dairy farms as part of the SDAS program. So in the previous version of the life cycle assessment, the average footprint was 1.1. However, I just talk about the stuff that the updates I'm after talking to you about. When you implement those, along with, you know, other some small changes, what happens is that the 1.1 is reduced down to 0.99. So this is our new average carbon footprint for a dairy farm in Ireland. It's basically a base change. So the farming system hasn't changed at all. It's just the way it's calculated has changed. And the reason it's reduced is because we're making it more representative of the emissions that are generated from Irish farming systems. Okay. So that's where we're starting at. So if you are a dairy farmer that's listening today, you can go on to your, I'm sure you got some form of communication that you can go on to Borbia online. You can go in, you can check your carbon footprint to know where you are, essentially what to benchmark yourself against, I suppose, your peers as other farmers. And that's your starting point, and how can we bring that number down, essentially. In terms of the beef side of things, any farmer that's part of the SBLAS can go on, they can check their carbon footprint for the beef they're producing. The Teagasc life cycle assessment models have been updated in line with what I've just talked about in terms of the dairy. The Board B, however, is not at the same stage as the dairy model. However, the process is underway, and the next couple of months, the Board B beef LCA model will be up to date and will be in line with the dairy model now. So just going on then, I suppose coming back to what Seamus was talking about, the mitigation strategies. So I will talk about the carbon footprint. What essentially the carbon footprint is an efficiency measure. When you express anything per kilo output, it's an efficiency measure. So the more efficient you are producing that product, the lower your carbon footprint is going to be. How you reduce your carbon footprint impacts your total emissions. So if you're improving, I suppose, the efficiency of your system, you're potentially creating scope to increase your productivity. And as a result, although you're reducing your emissions per kilo output, your total emissions could remain static. They could go up slightly or they could reduce slightly. To counteract this, that's why we need to look at our absolute emissions. We need to know the impact of different management practices on both carbon footprint as well as your absolute emissions. And this is very important because ideally, at the end of the day, what we're trying to find are mitigation strategies that can reduce both your footprint, so reduce your footprint, which is going to help the marketing of the product which you're producing, and your total emissions also. So as Pat was talking about and what Seamus was talking about, I'll be going through a couple of example farms. So just talk about some of the mitigation strategies that Seamus talked about. I just implemented them onto example Signpost farms and what impact they might have on their carbon footprint. So this is an example of one dairy farm that's part of the Signpost programme in 2019. So we say 2019 because it's the year before they started the Signpost programme. So it's what their starting point was before they actually changed anything. So this farmer was 0.96. So he's already better than the national average of 0.99. So already good starting point. However, talking to the farmer, there was a couple of areas which he wanted to change and he was going to improve on. So the first thing was he was already doing very well with the milk solids, 550 kilo milk solids. However, he felt he could go that bit further because it was a very young herd. And he was going to start selecting more for the milk constituents, so your fat and your protein. So he believed he was able to get to the 540 kilos solids between that and an older herd. Fertilizer, he was at the max of fertilizer. He was spending 250 kilos of nitrogen, the majority of which was in the form of CAN. As I said previously, CAN releases substantially more emissions than that of the likes of urea and protected urea. Therefore, he was trying to move away from the CAN to go towards protected urea. Protected urea is also going to help the farmer economically. It's it's cheaper per kilo of nitrogen than that of CAN at the moment also. In terms of manure management then, the full adoption of low emission slurry spreading, so your trail and shoe and your brand spreading. And Seamus has talked about these. This is just implementing these on farm, what actually happens in terms of your carbon footprint. You're basically reducing your reliance on synthetic fertilizer because you're increasing the amount of nitrogen available from the manure you spread. Turnout day, try to maximize your diet on the form of fresh grass and also reducing your reliance on meal. And what this essentially does is that by implementing those changes, this farmer was able to reduce their emissions by approximately around 16-17%. So 0.96 down to 0.8. Second farmer then, once again, starting at a very strong point at 0.9. So he's nearly 10% lower than that of the national average. So very good starting point. The farmer was happy where he was in terms of the animal production. He was getting 530 kilo solids. He didn't believe he could go much more without, having, system drift, more meal, more intensive system. So he was happy enough with how he was with his milk production. The fertility, 18% replacement rate. He was relatively happy with that. He could produce slightly more, but he was happy with it. So the areas what he really wanted to target was his fertilizer, which was 100% CAN in 2019. and it was 233 kilos per hectare. So he was trying to reduce it by 20% and go on 100% protected urea. And that's how you achieve that, as Seamus talked about, is ground up. You start with your soil fertility, get your indexes right, get your pH right. Then you go and you put in good grassland management, and then you also better manure management, incorporation of clover. They all contribute to less reliance on synthetic fertilizer. This farm as well, one of the main things was turnout dates. So he was part-time, turnout date up to the 20th of April. Try to get the cows out full-time before that date, and also trying to reduce reliance on meal. Impact of this then is that farmer was the carbon footprint reduced from 0.9 down to 0.77. So once again, that's a drop of around 14%. So just a summary of what I just talked about there. So life cycle assessment is the methodology to calculate emissions on farm, as well as other indicators if you wanted to calculate ammonia, nitrate leaching, as well as other indicators that could be done through life cycle assessment. The method has been updated as more research has come on stream. Irish research at that, to make sure that the numbers which we are providing are more accurate to the actual systems which we're measuring. There need to be continuous focus on efficiency-based measures, and the solutions need to be adopted quickly to get to be rewarded or to be credited in the national inventory. So the efficiency-based measures, the reason we focus on these is, yes, it's going to reduce your emissions per kilo output, and it's going to reduce your total farm emissions, but it's also going to improve the economic performance of the farm also, which is a benefit to the farmer. There's also a number of new, I suppose, mitigation strategies being tested out within Teagasc, as well as other research institutes. They're not on stream at the moment. However, they are in the process, and they will be available to farmers to further reduce their emissions in the future. So that's all I have for you. Thank you for listening, and any questions, more than happy to answer.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So we all could turn back on our screens. I suppose just a question for you. You looked at some of the, issues that are being assessed that have shown to have maybe a lower impact than was originally thought from basic tier 1 inventories. Are there any other elements of greenhouse gas emissions that are under investigation that have some possibilities in the same light? And are there some that maybe are going to lead to higher levels of emissions being shown?
Yeah, there's actually, it's very active at the moment within Teagasc. So I suppose to start with, there's a lot of work going on with methane at the moment. So at the moment, we're using an international methodology to calculate methane. We want to make that more representative of the grass-based diet that we have, which isn't what is common around the world, which the numbers which we're using are based on. So yeah, there's research being conducted in Teagasc Moorepark using the green feed machines. I think my colleague Ben Lahart was actually on this webinar a couple of months ago discussing them. And what that essentially is we're trying to derive our own methodology to calculate methane. And what we're preliminary results are finding is that we are slightly overestimating methane with our current methodology, particularly in the springtime. What we're seeing a seasonal effect on methane. Other areas we're looking at manure management, new emission factors, Irish emission factors for manure management, for lime application, and there's also work in carbon sequestration also.
Okay. Padraig, I'll hand over to you. Sometimes typos can give us interesting questions, because we have a question. I don't know which of the lads are going to answer it in relation to the national fairy herd. Padraig, you might.
Maybe there's a silver bullet in there somewhere, or fairy dust that'll solve a lot of the problems with that. I guess one of the main ones that's coming up is around the 1% reduction, Seamus, that you mentioned as regards 1% per week in the increase in the grazing period. Where one of the main questions is what period is your current calculation on, or where are you moving forward? Jonathan, you mentioned moving to having everything out before the end of April. So what's the basis there?
Yeah, well, I suppose now, Padraig, from the research done, Some farms might have a 6-month grazing season. They might extend it 1 more week. Other farms could have an 8-month grazing season, extended another week. Extending the week is where you're grazing better quality grass versus higher fibre silage, and you're also creating less slurry in the shed that has to be respread again by a slurry tanker. So regardless of your current time frame, if you can get another week onto it, it'll feed through in the figures at about 1% reduction for extra week of grass. Now, some farmers will probably push as far as they can go, and stocking rate will be the biggest determinant on that one.
Okay, Jonathan, there was a number of questions there as well for you, just around a lot of what you're looking at are mitigation strategies, and that seems to be where a lot of the research is based. Just on carbon sequestration, when are we going to see similar figures and see those incorporated in models that you're working with?
Yeah, so I'm sure it's been talked about here before, the carbon observatory that's been rolled out within Ireland. They're going around different sites and they're looking at the effect of different management practices and how that affects carbon sequestration, because we don't have the data available to us. We know that the ground is sequestering carbon. We need to validate that. We need to have solid numbers on that to implement them into life cycle assessments and methodology, and from there implement it into national inventory. So it's a long-term project. Carbon sequestration is a long-term process, but eventually, next couple of years, we should have good data available to us to show us that the effect of grazing, the effect of silage harvesting, the effect of reseeding, and then also peatlands as well, how that affects carbon sequestration. And once we have that, then we can come up with a methodology that can be certified, then we can implement it into it. But it's only starting at the moment, and it's going to take a couple of years. It's a slow process.
You're on a roll, Jonathan. While you're on a roll, LCA for greenhouse gas emissions for hill farms, and also for, say, beef finishing systems, store-to-beef finishing systems. When will we see them come on stream?
Yeah. So what we plan on doing actually is, so at the moment, the only way to calculate your carbon footprint is if you're signed up for Borbia. You could use an external tool from the likes of UK or France and all that. But with Teagasc, what we're planning on doing is to develop a tool that covers dairy, sheep, beef, and tillage, that a farmer can go into, an advisor can go into. You can put in your numbers, and from there you can calculate your carbon footprint. Now that's, once again, we've started the process, but that's essentially what we do, because there is a demand there. People want to know where they're starting. Yeah.
Okay. Do you use GWP 100 or GWP Star, and which and why? And we'll be back to you then, Seamus.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, so GWP Star, it's very topical at the moment. It's treating methane as if it's a circular gas, which it is. GWP Star, far more correct than GWP 100. The problem is trying to implement that at a farm level is difficult. You can implement GWP Star at a national level because we have data for it. To calculate GWP Star, you need 20 years data because it's all retrospective to where you were 20 years ago. At a farm level, do we have good enough data to know what production system you had 20 years ago? It's difficult to implement at farm level. So at the moment, it's GWP 100. I 100% agree with GWP Star, and it should be implemented at a national level. Implemented at a farm level, it's difficult.
Seamus, have there been any developments or anything, any research that you're aware of just around ammonia emissions from open tanks and maybe having shelter beds upwind from them? I guess a number of questions coming in on agroforestry and just the use of shelter beds for this question in particular on reducing ammonia emissions, but also around increasing the grazing period and agroforestry. So 2 questions, kind of tree related.
But the figures I put up there, Padraig, is just looking at extending the grazing season by a week, the knock-on effect it has on the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I know you've had presentations before where the shelter beds can extend the grazing season with certain types of stock. So the longer you can extend the grazing season, the more positive benefit it would have on it. In relation to the open tanks, I suppose the emissions from the open tanks, where it's coming from, is the ammonia being released. It's a part of the ammonia MAC. It's a small component of it, but it will have a big effect for individual farmers that they would have to cover them, I think, by 2027, if I'm correct on that one, Pat, there, on the year that they'll have to be covered by.
And I think there's potentially some likelihood of support for tree planting and shelter belts around in the next CAP. So we're hopeful that something will come out there.
Okay, Seamus, this one's definitely for you. Look, lots of compliments on the clarity of the presentation and the clarity of the measures that are there. How do you propose on getting this information out to advisors and from advisors onto farmers on the ground, Seamus? Obviously, a lot of work to be done in that.
And I suppose my role, Padraig, is a training and development specialist to help train our own advisors in Teagasc. We're working with the ACA as well. We're also working with our industry partners to try and get the shift from, like, say, canned to protected urea, incorporating more clover into the swards, reducing the protein in the meal, trying to improve soil fertility. So we're kind of hitting the ground running at the minute. The one thing I would say is there's almost 400 people on the call today, Padraig. So what I would like to ask everyone on the call, if you can tell 5 other people practical implications that they can undertake on their farm and get them to tell another 2 or 3 people each, we all have a role to spread positive message. Because the one thing is, I think actually farming is going to surprise the country that it will meet its emission targets, especially for the first 5 years. I think what we're being asked to do, if everyone puts their shoulder to the wheel, is very doable. I think a lot more doable than 300,000 electric cars by 2025 from the transport sector. But that is the role we have, Padraig, and I notice Siobhan Cavanagh's communication specialist is also helping try to get the message out there through the media in contact with our manager, Tom O'Dwyer.
Seamus giving people homework on a Friday evening, that's not on.
Absolutely, yeah. Be ambitious.
Jonathan, back to you on the global warming potential. A few questions in on why you need 20 years data. If you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah. So with the GWP star, you're treating methane as a circular gas. So it's, if the national herd remain the same, it's the same carbon being circled. Carbon goes in to grow grass, the cow eats the grass, turns to methane, and then that goes back down in the form of CO2 back to grow grass. And the cycle is said to be a 20-year cycle. So essentially why we need that is that, let's say today is, we're in 2021. If in 2001 we have the same number of animals than we have today, it's essentially the exact same carbon being circled around. So there's no additional warming caused by those animals being present on the farm. It's just because it's the life cycle of methane. That's the reason why you need 20 years data. We need to know, has the herd changed within that time period?
Okay, good stuff. Lots of praise coming in for the 2 presentations, guys. And here's one we'll throw at both the. I guess zero grazing has become a more common. And have you got it included in any of your LCAs? And 2, is it helping to kind of increase the sequestration because you can get access to the grass all year round, similar to extending the grazing, or for a longer period, not necessarily all year round, but similar to extending the grazing, like what you had with James? Yeah,
like zero graze grass can be implemented in LCA very easy. You just change the diet from grass silage to fresh grass, because that's what it is. In terms of carbon sequestration, there's research there is research on the way on the effect of cutting grass, how that affects carbon sequestration. I can't say here now today what exactly it is, but it is going to come on stream in the next couple of years, what impact it does have.
I suppose there's a comment on that one, Padraig. Look, I suppose the big thing with zero grazing, it's important that the overall stocking rate, like a stocking rate of 2.4 cows per hectare, you need to be growing over 14 tonne of grass across the whole farm. So that's the fundamental, first of all. Don't overstock the whole farm. But as well as that, look, once you start going over 3.5 cows per hectare on a milking block, it's getting fairly intensive then at that stage. So it's and the cows end up being inside a lot more of the year. So is the overall stocking rate no more than 2.4, and probably the milking platform, even with the zero grass brought back in, being around maybe the 3 to 3.5 mark, not to over push things.
And is there a concern in relation to that you have a lot more slurry, and slurry tends to have more both ammonia emissions and greenhouse gas emissions than deposited urine and feces directly onto pasture?
Yeah, absolutely, Pat, because you are kind of increasing the indoor period, which is creating more greenhouse gases. But as well as that, like when we're on about the sustainability, it's important that the farmer is sustainable too, and zero grazing does create more work for the farmer. So we also have to be very cognizant of the farmer, that we don't push the farmer too hard.
Question there.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, a question there. Is there any studies on carbon sequestration values of hedges in particularly hedges of different compositions?
Yeah, no. Teagasc down in Johnson Castle are doing a good lot of work down there in terms of carbon sequestration on hedgerows. And it's actually really good what they're doing. They're using satellite imagery to calculate the LiDAR technology. They're calculating the density of hedgerows or maybe scrub areas. And from that, they're able to determine how much carbon is there and how does that change over time. Once again, it's not at the stage where it can be implemented, like the actual validated methodology to implement that at LCA basis and national imagery basis is not fully there yet, but the research in terms of hedgerows it's well underway. Yeah.
But I suppose
That was something. Sorry, Seamus, go ahead.
Yeah, the big one of sequestration is, look, I suppose if they discover that we are sequestrating a certain amount, we'll just say we're starting with 23 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, just say for argument's sake it's 1 million tonnes, we're then starting at 22 million tonnes. It's not like the 1 million tonnes we've discovered that we're sequestering comes off what we have to reduce, okay? So the sequestration will help the farmers, but it's not the silver bullet to help us reduce the emissions. We still have to work to get this, the lime, the soil fertility, switched fertiliser use, and in the part of the Climate Action Bill, a plan for 2021, it's predicated on 65% of all can being spread as protected urea by 2030. That we spread 90% of our slurry by low emission slurry spreading, and that farmers in general reduce their fertiliser by 20% by 2030. They're three of the big things that are in the Carbon Action Plan for 2021, and a lot of our figures are being based upon. Okay? Yeah. So sequestration will help us long term, but as an industry, we need to make the move and start creating actions at a huge level throughout the whole country to move the dial and to show that agriculture is going to reduce its overall emissions, help improve profitability for farmers.
There's a question there about the fertilizer prices in the coming year and how farmers are going to cope with the issue of nearly a trebling in nitrogen prices in particular, and what was opportunity that gives you to try and get messages out there in terms of how to be more efficient. What are going to be your key messages to clients?
Well, I suppose the key message, first of all, Pat, is to mine the slurry. And the slurry, rather than going out just because you can on the 12th of January in some cases, maybe to hold off until February and to use the slurry to replace the first round. And I really seen it in my own area last year. The first round of fertilizer was very much replaced by slurry in the form of the low emission slurry spreading. And 2,500 gallons of slurry with a low emission slurry spreader in February-March period can replace 23 units of nitrogen. That's your first round. So that's the important thing, first of all, is mining the slurry. It's like liquid gold. That's what we need to start treating it like at this stage. The next thing then is protected urea at the minute is about 20%, even though prices have gone ridiculous at this stage, it's still 20% cheaper than can equivalent on a unit of nitrogen basis. So definitely make the switch. And you can't expect the supplier to have the protected urea in the yard the day you go in to buy it. So the task I would say to anyone on this morning is get their farmers to start looking for protected urea now, because the industry will get it if the demand is there. If the demand is there, they won't have it in when you need it, and it doesn't store long term over the winter period. And then it's tailoring the amount of fertilizer, so it's reducing a little bit throughout the whole year. And I know when the questions come in there, 25% reduction is too much to ask a dairy farmer. It is, absolutely. But we're talking about getting the soil fertility right, and over time, getting the lime right, first of all. For those have the soil fertility right, start incorporating clover, mixed species swards, that would help reduce fertilizer over time. A 10% reduction in fertilizer on a dairy farm can reduce emissions by 2%. 10% is very doable. We did it in 90.
Yeah. There's two. Sorry, Jonathan, you want to add to that?
No, like just my stuff that the work I'll be doing with life cycle assessment, the biggest reduction that can be achieved is just a straight switch from fertilizer types.
Yeah. And to put that in perspective, Padraig, a switch from 100% can to 100% protected urea is the same as cutting your fertilizer by 40%. Yeah. Huge gains.
There's another related question there and it's asking about the issue of blending of protected urea with phosphate, and I think that is a no-go area. But I think there's work being done on the emissions from some of the high pK compounds. Jonathan, you're with it, and the fact that some of those are actually lower emitting than your can as well.
Exactly. Yeah. They're doing research. Sorry, Pat, you did ask me that earlier on. They are doing work. So the work we've done so far in fertilizer, it's for can, 27% nitrogen, protected urea, and just normal urea. What they're doing now is looking at the emissions from compounds, the likes of your 10, 10, 20, 18, 6, 12, and even your P and K fertilizers as well. And yeah, when we get them on stream, we should see another reduction.
And I think the initial findings are that the losses from those compounds are less than from. So they can become part of the solution.
Yeah, there's a nice few questions there, Pat, just around, I suppose, the sentiment. There's two trains of thought. One is that dairy and beef consumption will increase. The demand will be there for these luxury proteins for decades to come as it will continue to increase. Why would we let other countries produce it at a less efficient production level than ourselves? And the other train of thought is reduce the herd, reduce the problem, or reduce the herd and pay farmers more for their product. And just to comment on that, guys.
Yeah, I was coming in there on that one. Look, I suppose, but into context, from a dairy point of view, our footprint is about roughly 1 kilo of carbon dioxide per kilo of milk produced. Internationally, it's closer to 2.9. So we're about a third, almost about a third of the international figure. Beef for one of the lowest carbon footprints again within the EU. And I suppose when people talk about replacing what you eat in your diet, they use the international figure. So rather than saying you shouldn't be eating meat or milk, what they should be saying is you should eat Irish meat and milk. That's what they should be saying, first of all. We will lay way lower footprint. I suppose the big issue is we're part of the EU. The EU is about 10% of international emissions overall. EU wants to be best in class. They've set a target of 55% reduction by 2030. As part of that, the Irish government has set a reduction of 51% for the economy, and agriculture has been built into that at 22 to 30%. That is the bigger picture. We cannot change. That's policy. The sentiment, I wouldn't disagree with it, but I suppose we have to work within the framework for it that we have to work with it.
Jonathan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. So yeah, they're referring to carbon leakage, and it does happen. You know, if we don't produce it and the demand is going to go up, somebody less efficient is going to fill that gap, and total global emissions will probably go up. However, as Seamus talked about, we are tied to reduction in our national emissions, and we have to be seen to achieve those. You know, and you know, there's a possibility we can maintain our production, increase production, but we have to do so in a more carbon efficient manner. That's what we need to do.
Okay. Sorry, yeah.
Go ahead. No, we're great.
No. I think we're nearly hitting our time. So I'd like to thank the two speakers for absolute clarity in the messaging. I think it was really clear. And Jonathan, I think your update on kind of the research that's coming through in terms of the level and the representing of the research that's been carried out by a lot of your colleagues was really clear and really welcome. So thank you very much for that. Next week we'll be back, and we're joined by colleagues from AFBI in Northern Ireland, Donncha Doody and Russell Adams, looking at some of the initiatives that they're looking at to manage the risk of pea loss from slurry in Northern Ireland, where it is a major part of their environmental problem. Slightly bigger than ours, but we have a lot of it as well. So I think it'll be a really interesting presentation from the two researchers with AFBI. So thank you very much again for joining us this morning. Thanks to our presenters. Thanks to Andy Boland and Yvonne Marr, our production team. And until next week.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.